Hey everybody, Joseph Klosick with Saltmarsh Properties here with Keller Williams, and I hope you're doing great. I really appreciate you jumping on today's video. This is actually a topic that's near and dear to my heart because I'm kind of a nerd when it comes to contracts. Now, I'm not an attorney, so anything I say to you is not legal advice today. This is really just to highlight some areas for you to keep an eye on for when you get an offer on your home, just some areas that you can maybe take a look at, spend some extra time in to make sure that you're covered in this, and just some things to look out for. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump right into this and go through this. And of course, at any time, if you have any questions, if you want to shoot me an email, click to follow on this, reach out to us on social media. We're happy to help you in any way. So when you receive an offer on your house in South Carolina, 9 times out of 10, you will receive it on what we call Form 310. This is the agreement or contract to buy and sell real estate. And I'm going to go through the basics of this pretty quickly and then highlight some areas for you to definitely take a look at. So the first part, section 1 here, is the parties. Basically, that's going to be who the buyer and seller are, some definitions of what to look at here in the contract. Then we jump into some agency disclosures if they are represented by a buyer's agent. If you were represented by a listing agent, this is where it would be disclosed. Then we get to purchase price. Now, purchase price section 2 is obviously a pretty important one. That's how much the buyer is offering to purchase your home. But I think there's 2 important parts to really look at this. The first part is whether or not they're going to be getting financing, if they're going to do a combination of financing and cash, which is really almost always going to be the case, or if it's going to be a strict cash deal. So 2 things to look at on that. Number 1, if it's going to be financing, we'll cover that here in a second. If it's a combination of financing or cash, you then want to then say whether or not they're sending any sort of verification of cash that's available. And you do, in my opinion, you want to keep an eye on this, because if it's a cash deal, or if they're getting a loan, which we'll talk about later, that's 50%, that's a lot of money that they'll be bringing to the table. So it's not unfair or unlikely for you to ask for some sort of verification of that. So that's just something to keep in mind in this section if they are offering a cash deal, or if they're only financing a small portion of the property. So that's the first area that we really want to take a look at when you receive an offer. The next part we're going to jump down to is going to be section 4, which is going to be the conveyance, closing, or possession. Just some things to keep in mind on this is this enough time, right? Are you going to have enough time between now and closing for you to move out? Is the buyer giving themselves enough time to do their inspections and go through everything? This does seem kind of silly and self-explanatory, but I think a lot of times people misunderstand really how long it does take to go through this process. Yet they'll put a quick close in there to make it more of an appealing offer, and you just want to make sure you're exploring all the details behind it if you do have a quick close in there, that everyone can actually close on time, including you. There's a lot when it goes to moving and packing in a house. The next part we're going to jump into in this is, I mentioned earlier, starts to involve the money. Now, earnest money is the first part where money shows up on this. This is not consideration for the contract. Earnest money is basically a deposit that the buyer will put in on the property that's basically, for lack of a better way to put it, a promise that they'll perform on the contract. Now, this is an area where I would say gets very dicey, and if you do have specific questions, you definitely want to consult an attorney. But here's the bottom line. You'll see the big, bold, black paragraph here that we have on this. This is basically telling you that the parties understand, you being a party to the contract, understand that earnest money is held by an escrow agent. An escrow agent is licensed by the state. They're also monitored by the state. And what this is saying in all of the big, bold, scary lettering here is that in the event that someone does default on the contract or break the contract or terminate the contract, the earnest money is not simply just given to whoever they think is at fault. There's only 2 ways that the earnest money is actually given. Number 1 is all parties agree. So there's a mutually signed agreement after the contract is terminated. Or the second one, they are ordered by the court. And that would either come from a court order, some sort of lawsuit that would come into this. Again, not to scare you, but I think a lot of times we don't do justice to earnest money. And a lot of people think, well, if the buyer walks, I'll just get my earnest money. Or if the seller walks, I'll just get my earnest money. And it's just not that simple. So that's another area to keep in mind on that. The next one we're going to jump down to does involve financing. I mentioned it earlier, and it starts with transaction costs. Now, obviously, if you're the seller in the transaction, you're not going to have any financing transaction costs, but you will have some basic transaction costs that this covers in here. What I want to point out on this one is this is an area where a buyer could ask for you to contribute concessions not to exceed a certain number towards their closing costs at closing. Now, for some people, this may seem weird, right? Why, as a seller, would I pay a buyer some money to close on my house? But what I will say is about 53% of the transactions in the greater Charleston area that closed have had some sort of seller concessions that were paid to the buyer. So this is something that you will just want to keep in mind when you get the offer, because you may have a full price offer back on page 1, but then they're asking for you to contribute towards their closing costs here on page 3. And that's just something, or excuse me, page 2. And that's something that you want to make sure you keep in mind. Again, it's all negotiable. It doesn't mean you have to. It just starts with an offer. The next part we're going to jump down to is going to be financing. Financing is an area you want to keep an eye on. If it's realistic financing, this is what I mentioned earlier. If they're asking for if they're saying that they're going to apply for a small percentage of the purchase price for financing, therefore needing a large down payment, that's when you'd want to look for verification of funds. The other one is that they have 2 deadlines in here. Number 1 is that they've applied by financing by a certain date. And then the second one is that they have received what we call an initial approval letter, right? And this is really a pre-approval, those sorts of things. Here's the thing to keep in mind. If they haven't applied for the loan yet before they put an offer in on the house, that could be maybe not a red flag, but definitely a yellow flag. So you want to find out where they are in the process. So that applied by date should be really within 24 hours, if not less, than when you ratify the contract. The second thing is that second date that's in there is for what we're calling initial approval. The verbiage that gets often missed in this paragraph comes down this next one, which basically says that final approval of this will occur when the loan is funded. So it says right here, final approval of the loan occurs when the lender funds the loan. Basically, that's at closing. So a lot of people understand is the financing contingency for all intents and purposes lasts until closing. Now, obviously, if the buyer does something to mess up their funding or goes out and buys a Porsche or something along those lines, you may have cause to say, okay, that wouldn't be protected in there. But if something comes up and they don't get the loan at the very last minute, there could be an issue there. So again, it's not to say that happens often, but we just want to make sure we point out some areas where a lot of people say, well, we got this initial approval within the first week. There's still some time in there that you want to make sure you're staying on top of the buyer to make sure they're going through the process, the lender has everything that they need, and there aren't any red flags there. The next part, and this is the part where it really gets to be the most fun, is due diligence. So due diligence is section 8. And basically what this is saying is that for a period of time, they'll set a date here, the home is will be in what we call due diligence. And basically the best way to describe that is to basically say that at any time, for really any reason, the buyer can walk away from the contract. Now, it does allow for you to ask for a termination fee in there. But the way that we describe this to our sellers is that during due diligence, a buyer can walk away for any reason or no reason at all. And that's a really important thing to keep in mind, because a lot of times you think you have a contract, you're good to go. Even if you're willing to fix all of the problems they find during the inspection period, there's still a risk that the buyer could say, you know what, because of due diligence, I'm going to pay that termination fee, and then I'm going to basically be released from the contract. And it's really a unilateral termination that happens there, as long as they pay the fee, which is mapped out here. And this can range anywhere from a couple $100s to a few $1,000s. It's negotiable. They pay that termination fee, and then they send a termination document, and that's all they have to do to get out of the contract. So that's something to keep in mind there. The other ones that I want to just talk about quickly are going to be the other contingencies that you have. Regardless of due diligence, even if you're out of due diligence, if it is contingent on appraised value, make sure that obviously if you are people are bidding up on your house or anything along those lines, it still realistically can appraise. And then you have what we call the wood infestation report, often known as the CL100. This is an additional inspection that's done, can be done outside of due diligence, does not have to be done during due diligence. And this is when the home will be inspected for any sort of termites, moisture damage, or anything along those lines. And then you're given the opportunity as the seller to remedy those. If you do agree to remedy those, then the buyer does agree to move forward on the contract. So that is, you are somewhat protected in that part. So those are some of the highlights of the contract that I think you should keep in mind when you get an offer. And then again, this is an extensive overview of the contract. There are many other parts to it that I'm happy to explain, but I just wanted to go through some quick areas for you. When I say quick, it's a little bit of a long video, but hopefully it was helpful for you, and you can kind of see some things to keep an eye on once you get an offer on your house. So if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to let us know. Happy selling and have a great day. Take care.